So this has been the process to date. We released a draft Creek Buffer Ordinance on January 14th. The initial public comment period on that draft has been extended to April 7th. You can email any comments through the email on the screen, creekbuffers@santabarbaraca.gov. On our website, you can also sign up for individual appointments to discuss the ordinance and go through your property or whatever questions you may have. You're also just feel free to contact me. I'm Melissa Hetrick. My information's on the screen anytime with a phone call, or I can set up a meeting. And then this is one of 2 question and answer webinars that we're having today's. And then we're having another one on April 2nd from 6 to 7 p.m. So after this initial comment period, where we've been meeting with stakeholders and holding public meetings, we're going to do revisions to the ordinance. And again, you're welcome to comment anytime. You're not really limited to our public comment window, but if you want to make sure that our revisions to the ordinance really consider your comments, then I get them in before April 7th. So we'll be spending the spring and the summer, several months, making revisions to the ordinance based on all the comments we're hearing. And then we'll release a revised draft ordinance, probably late summer. From there, we'll have a series of stakeholder meetings, open houses, and webinars on the draft ordinance to hear from the community again. And then only after all that and additional revisions will a final draft ordinance go to the Sustainability Council Committee and Creeks Advisory Committee for comments, and then the recommendation to approve process through Planning Commission, Ordinance Committee, and then finally City Council. So just quickly, for those of you that don't know what a creek buffer is, it's simply a natural area between a creek and new development, as shown in this picture. And really the purpose of creek buffers are many. They reduce public safety risks from creek erosion and flooding. In addition, they limit alterations to the creek. So we see a lot where people unintentionally or intentionally put stuff in the creeks, either to stop erosion or other structures. And what those can do is actually speed up or change flow patterns and cause erosion and additional flooding in downstream areas. And so we want to limit kind of those ad hoc alterations to the creek as much as possible to keep drainage where it's supposed to go. In addition, creek buffers protect riparian and aquatic habitats and enhance water quality and preserve scenic beauty. So the city has a number of existing creek buffer policies and regulations. Our general plan actually directs establishment of minimum creek buffer regulations to address the cumulative impacts of development with regard to hazards and biological impacts. In addition, if you come in now for any permit, discretionary permits such as design review or other for new structures, that requires compliance or environmental compliance with the state California Environmental Quality Act. And as part of that and the protections in that act to sensitive habitats and hazard reduction measures, buffers are determined on a case-by-case basis now based on technical reports. So if you come in now and you're proposing a new building, generally within 100 feet of the creek, you would have to determine your buffer from the top of bank of the creek through the technical reports, which are paid for by the applicant and done by consultants. And it's really an arduous process. And so one of our biggest goals with this ordinance is to limit the need for technical reports and this case-by-case process to only the areas like closest to the creek and really avoid all that process between 50 and 100 feet in particular. In addition, our housing element directs creation of objective creek buffer standards to provide assurance and clarity to housing projects. So in 2019, our coastal land use plan actually implemented creek buffer regulations in the coastal zone. So that's the area closest to the coast within the city. So these already apply when you need a coastal development permit. And there's a number of regulations in the coastal land use plan, but they, in addition to several protection measures, there are development buffers from Topanga creeks ranging from 35 feet in the Lower Mission Flood Control Project to 50 feet for our other creeks. And in addition, there's a process to reduce buffers on severely constrained lots. So just as we're going through existing regulations, I did want to talk about our federal floodplain regulations because there's a lot of confusion about how this relates to creek buffers. So our existing federal floodplain regulations required by FEMA are incorporated into City Municipal Code Title 2224. So we are required by the federal government to implement these federal regulations. They're based on FEMA flood maps, which can be viewed either on the FEMA website or on our city's map system, which shows all kinds of different assets or mapping abilities for the city, including your floodplain designation. And those maps, those flood insurance rate maps, are what FEMA uses to determine flood insurance rates for property owners. The maps also designate or map out what's called the FEMA regulated floodplain and then the FEMA regulated floodway. So the floodplain is the area where flooding occurs in a severe storm, and in those areas, new or rebuilt structures must be flood-proofed above what's called the base flood elevation. So the floodway is different than the floodplain. The floodplain is where any water can pool or flood, but the floodway is really limited to the portion of a creek that is fast moving, where debris can go down it, that experiences the most amount of forces, and where the biggest hazard is for erosion and flooding. And so in these smaller floodway areas, flood insurance is more expensive, but also there are very strict limitations from the federal government disallowing any new development unless you get what's called a verification of no effect to flood levels or a no rise exemption. So if you're in these designated floodways, there are a lot of existing federal limitations. So if anybody has questions about that, I'm happy to pass on the maps and information about that. So just to say that creek buffers are separate from these floodplain regulations. And I get asked a lot, why do we need creek buffers if we have regulations for structures to be flood-proofed above base flood elevation? And the reason is that structures can be flood-proof. So like the bottom layer could be waterproof, but that doesn't prevent erosion from creeks undercutting structures or otherwise compromising them. And in addition, floodplain regulations don't protect the removal of riparian and creek habitats or changes to the actual creek. So the goals of the proposed ordinance is to have a citywide ordinance that's clear and provides objective regulations throughout the city. We're proposing for the ordinance to apply citywide except for the airport area, which has specific regulations pertaining to Goleta Slough. The ordinance will not impact FEMA floodplain regulations or firm maps or associated flood insurance. We want to have straightforward regulations that streamline permitting and maximize protections while avoiding takings and impacts to property owners. We're really trying to encourage redevelopment to reduce safety risks and ensure that our housing mandates are met. In addition, we want to make sure that the ordinance does not interrupt any ability to prepare for wildfires or otherwise mitigate the risks of wildfire. We want to make sure that the buffer distances can be achieved at most parcels, and where there are constrained lots, there's a process for reducing the buffers as needed. And we want the ordinance to give assurances that rebuilding can occur as long as basic safety findings can be made. So as we looked at development of the minimum buffer distances, we did look at a number of sources. We looked at a number of technical reports that have been prepared over the years to determine what kind of buffers are appropriate for the city. That included a creeks inventory and assessment study and creek development standards study that proposed buffers between 50 feet and 150 feet for the city. We are going with the lower of that amount because it's more fitting to our development pattern and the fact that we are a very urban city. We looked at erosion rates on our creek and bordering habitat areas that are required to be protected. And then we really looked at configurations of existing parcels and development. So we literally mapped different instances along the creeks and looked at the parcels and really tried to look at where buffers could be achieved to make sure that that the majority of parcels could achieve them, and where there are parcels that can't achieve them, that there's a process for them to still rebuild. And in addition, we reviewed other jurisdictions' buffers. Most jurisdictions in the state already have creek buffer ordinances, including all of our regional neighbors. Santa Barbara County has buffers of 50 feet from urban creeks and then ranging up to 200 feet for major rivers. City of Galitas is 100 feet, and then City of Carpinteria is 50 feet. So these are the proposed minimum buffers right now in the ordinance. It's 50 feet from major creeks, 35 feet from public flood control projects. So those are portions of Mission Creek where we have publicly maintained flood control projects that have stabilized creek banks. In addition, any other creeks that meet the state definition of a creek, and therefore the state has jurisdiction over, but are not one of these major creeks, which has a smaller flow. We are proposing a 15 feet setback from top of bank. So some of you may have seen this map. This is just a screening map of potential creeks in the city. And the reason it's disjointed is it only shows above ground portions of creeks, not where they're underground or piped. In addition, this map is not in the ordinance. The ordinance really applies to what's on the ground. And so it's really just a screening tool to see if you might be by a creek. This map has been used by the city since the 90s to screen for creek setbacks. And so we're always trying to improve it over time. So we are getting a lot of input right now from landowners wanting us to take a look at their minor creeks to see if they actually would be considered a creek. And we are going out on site visits in those cases and either taking those areas off the map or leaving them on depending on the determination. So if you have an area like that you want us to check out, please contact us and we're happy to come out. The ordinance also includes new definitions for top of bank that we hope are easier than the existing definitions for the Mission Creek ordinance. And then again, the proposed ordinance only applies to new development or substantial redevelopment. So that's when you're completely rebuilding a building or a structure. It applies only to above ground sections of creek. It allows for new development and buffers, and we'll talk about that. And it includes a process to reduce buffers for constrained lots. It outlines a process for non-conforming existing structures in the buffers, and we'll talk about that in detail. And it ensures that disaster rebuilds or voluntary rebuilds can occur with safety findings to at least the previous square footage of building that you had before. So non-conforming existing development, so that's existing development that is within the buffers that may be repaired and maintained without any additional permits from the city. So in addition, additions are allowed if they do not increase the nonconformity, meaning that the addition is outside the buffer. In addition, changes of use can happen, entire remodels can happen. You can also do alterations. It's just when you go to completely redevelop the building that it then would be considered a new structure that has to apply the buffer regulations or apply for a reduction in buffer. So some of the things that are allowed without any advanced approval or debris removal, abatement of emergency conditions, vegetation maintenance for fire-related purposes. In addition, things like home hardening activities, replacement of windows and other things, and then maintenance and repair. Some of the types of new development that are allowed in buffers with a building permit clearance. And let me just explain that for a moment because there's been some confusion. So all of these things right now would require a building permit or grading permit now. And so all this is saying in the ordinance is that when you come in for that building permit, that when it gets routed for what's called a zoning check to see if you need additional permits, that the planner can check, yes, this is allowed, no further permits needed. So the intent of this is not to add a permit, but rather just say, as part of your building permit, these things are allowed. So it's things like access ways and trails, signs, lighting, fences, removal of hazardous trees, stormwater management, ADA improvements. And this is an area of the ordinance that we really are hearing a lot of input about, good input about, and are looking at additions or changes to make sure that people, minor uses like paper patios and things like that can be accommodated. So if you have a severely constrained lot where you can't develop outside the buffer, then there's a process to get a modification to reduce the buffer size. And it essentially requires the technical reports that are required now for most cases. So really what this ordinance would do is eliminate the need for technical reports beyond the 50 feet or 35 feet or 15 feet, depending on the type of creek. But if you are proposing to build within the buffer, you still would have to prepare these technical reports that help us make safety findings and other findings. So the modifications to reduce the buffers, there's a number of cases where you can get a modification for vacant lots. If you want to build a single family residence, you can build within the buffer up to a 1,200 square foot house, garage and accessory uses. If you're completely rebuilding or replacing an existing structure, you can get a structure at least up to the same size you had before. So if you had a 3,000 square foot structure, you'd be able to get 3,000 square foot structure plus a garage and accessory uses. In addition, they, for multifamily properties, you can get an approval for up to the maximum number of units that you're currently allowed with zoning, with this modification. And in addition, if you need to, stabilize the creek banks in order to protect existing development, you can go through this process also. So again, the findings are mostly safety related, that whatever you're doing will not cause erosion to your neighbors or other properties, and that the structure is as far away as possible from the creek. So as far as accessory dwelling units, we're hearing a lot about those. Of course, ADUs are allowed per our existing zoning outside the buffer. If you are proposing certain types of state mandated ADUs, they can also be placed inside the buffer. But in order to obtain that, you need a geologist report checkoff that would be done at building permit stage. So this does not require a long discretionary approval. It's a checkoff with a geologic report addressing safety. So I just wanted to go through some of the big kind of comments and questions we've gotten today. We've gotten a lot of questions about existing structures and repairs, and really it's not the intent of this ordinance to prevent people from repairing their houses, doing seismic upgrades, re-roofing your structures, all of that. The intent of the ordinance is that those things don't apply to this ordinance, that it really should be addressing new structures. And so we're thinking about a lot of modifications to really make that very clear, and I can talk about some of those later. We've got a lot of comments about minor creeks. We've gotten a kind of 50-50, half are in support of the ordinance because they're having problems with neighbors putting stuff in minor creeks and redirecting flow onto unfit areas or neighboring areas. And so there's been issues with that. And then there's also been a lot of comments that, hey, this drainage shouldn't be considered a creek, that it doesn't have enough flow. So again, we are completely open to looking at any of those drainages or creeks. In addition, there's been concern with how to determine the top of bank on these minor creeks. This is another area where we're looking at, can we just take the setback from the center line and instead of the top of bank and make things easier? So we're definitely considering several edits to this minor creek category. In addition, we've been getting a lot of question about rebuilding after natural disasters. The way that the ordinance is written now is the same as the Santa Barbara County ordinance and City of Goleta ordinance, that if your house or structure is completely destroyed, that you could rebuild at least up to your existing square footage, but you would have to try to move it away from the creek as far as possible. Now, we have heard from people concerns about that with regard to fire insurance, and we are looking at edits to potentially exempt fire rebuilds in place to really make that process easier. In addition, I had a lot of questions about, like, what if my house floods and I need to repair it? In general, those repairs would not be a complete rebuild, and so they would be, or we want them to be exempt under this ordinance. We really only want to do all the analysis and technical reports and stuff when we're talking about complete new structures. In addition, we've had concerns about impacts to flood and fire insurance rates. As I mentioned earlier, flood insurance rates are based by the federal government on federal FEMA maps, and this ordinance doesn't change those. In addition, for fire insurance, I mentioned that we are considering a fire exemption, but also anything you would need to do to prepare for a fire. So fuel modification, vegetation maintenance, home hardening. We can definitely clarify that that's exempt from the ordinance. The intent was for those things to be exempt. In addition, we've been hearing concerns about property values. We've also been hearing, support to reduce hazards, especially in the wake of the Montecito debris flow and the impacts that occurred to our community during that. We've heard a lot of support to protect creek habitats. We've heard a lot of complaints about neighbors' activities in near creeks and also city activities in near creeks. And then we've gotten a lot of requests. So requests for a higher trigger for what's called substantial redevelopment. And we are considering edits to that to really make it so a structure is not considered a new structure until it's like you're truly rebuilding the foundational, like all the foundational elements of the structure. In addition, we've heard requests for more uses in the buffers, especially if they're not super close to the creek edge. So we're considering some of those. We've also had requests for fewer uses within the buffer. We've had the request for changing the definition of feasible to be stricter. We've been getting comments on both sides, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Some people want larger creek buffers and some want smaller. And then we've gotten a lot of requests for the city or county to maintain creeks. So I've already mentioned that some of these, but these are some of the ideas of things that just talking with you all, which has been very useful. It's very useful for us to talk to homeowners and other people and really look at properties and see how the ordinance will play out on a property. And that is really informative to us as far as looking at potential changes to the ordinance. So some of the ideas for potential changes that are already kind of out there are, allowing more backyard type accessory uses that are new in buffers if they're not right up against the creek. Again, changing the trigger for substantial redevelopment so that things like seismic upgrades and things like that just definitely wouldn't trigger it. That you would really have to be demoing and rebuilding an entire structure to meet that. And then I think I mentioned we're looking at a number of changes with the minor creeks, potentially making the 15-foot setback from center line or other changes, allowing fire rebuilds in place as an exemption. Again, further clarifying that any fire safety measures are exempt. And then we've heard a lot of concerns about people's unpermitted development. And so we're trying to think about some kind of grace period or something to address that concern. So I've already taken up a lot of time, and so I want to keep this on the screen so people have our contact, but also open it up for questions. And Erin, have you gotten some questions in the chat, or should we start? That we should start?
There are, yeah, let's start with the chat. There are a few.
Okay.
What are some specific examples of technical reports? And I believe this came in when you were kind of describing the current process.
Yeah, so it depends on the property, but generally it's a geologic report, soils report, and then a hydrology report, usually combined, that looks at erosion near on the property and geologic instability, in addition to biological reports. So are there sensitive habitat species on the property? So right now, those are generally required if you're proposing a new structure within 100 feet of the creek. And we're really trying to, knowing that we don't have those huge amounts of erosion and huge riparian areas in the city, we're hoping to limit the need for all those technical reports to just if you're going within the 50 feet or 35 feet that are in these buffers.
And then related to that, there was a follow-up question that how will these technical reports be reviewed, and will there be a procedure for peer review by licensed professionals?
Yeah, so the right now, the way those technical reports are working is that when they are required, the applicant pays a consultant to prepare them. So the applicant hires the consultant, and assuming they meet minimum qualifications, those are usually accepted by staff. Staff does review them to make sure that the appropriate findings or analysis is in there. If there is a dispute, which is not very common, the city can require a peer review. But I've only seen that in like very, very limited situations.
Okay, and then this one is in relation to minor creeks, and I don't want to read the whole thing because it's kind of long, but basically how the rationale for including minor creeks came up, the comparable jurisdictions that we've referenced have limited their ordinance to larger recognized delineated creeks, whereas, yeah.
So yeah, it really depends on the jurisdiction. So the city of Gladed definition of a creek is it's very similar to ours. And so all kinds of creeks would be that meet the state definition would require a setback. Santa Barbara County only has a setback on creeks that have a mapped floodway, which in general, I would say correspond to the major creeks. And for minor drainages, they have other regulations just preventing blockage of flow. And so that's kind of some of the examples. So of other jurisdictions out there.
And then the last part of this question was the city should survey each property and determine whether a minor creek exists and where the setback extends to. And yeah, do you want me to answer this or do you?
Yeah, I would just say that we would love to have a whole survey of all the creeks and all their properties and be able to just map them and not have all these case-by-case determinations. For creeks, though, they move around, and with erosion, they change. In addition, the city just doesn't have the ability to survey the conditions, like soil conditions at every property. So with the buffers, we're really just trying to make an area we know it like is going to be pretty fine, right? And then only require these technical reports when something's proposed closer. Is that, Erin, you want to add to that?
Yeah.
Or no? Okay.
Yeah, no, I mean, the feasibility of doing a survey on every private property, we don't have access to every private property either. We'd have to get some sort of agreement from every property owner to come on and do a survey. It's a big effort. Okay, next question was, do minor creeks require technical reports currently within 100 feet of a screening map of a designated creek?
I would say generally not 100 feet away from the minor creeks, but yes, if you're proposing something near a minor creek.
Okay, let's see. Some of these I'm like trying to read if they're a comment or question.
That these these policies that we have now to implement CEQA are all not written down somewhere, and that's really what we're trying to do with the ordinance. Everybody can see all the rules in one place so that it's not this case by case and amorphous policies that people that they're hard to figure out. Yeah.
Okay, so this next question is, why do there have to be limits on rebuilding? I worry in my specific case, if my property is damaged, it will require review outside of the creek area. I'm not sure if I'm fully following, but if you're talking about work that would happen outside the proposed buffer, the current review process on that would not change.
So I think it depends. So rebuilding, we always, in those cases, always require structures to come up to like existing safety building codes and other safety features. And so because at that point, when you're rebuilding, you're essentially creating a new building that's going to be all around for 75 years or whatever it might be again. And we want to ensure that it's safe. And so that's the main factor associated with that. Again, looking at exemptions for fire rebuild, understand that those are unique situations. In general, this issue was greatly discussed when the coastal land use plan was approved with the similar regulations. And I think especially after the debris flow and all that happened there, council and planning commission really felt like as we do redevelop over time that we should, if we can, try to move structures away from the creek if it's possible. But that said, the city doesn't want to prevent you from totally rebuilding. That's not the purpose of this ordinance at all. We want to make sure that you can replace your house and all that kind of stuff.
Okay, this next one is more of a comment, but basically, thanks for extending the comment period, and that an ask for staff to consider exempting properties that contain historic resources.
Yeah, that's something we're looking at. I think we would still have to look at safety findings in some cases, but yes, that's it's very hard to with historic resources, and so we're really looking at the details on that one.
The next one I think is a follow-up to the original one with about the limitations on rebuilding. It says I have a garage on the border of my property, which it sounds like I will not be able to improve or replace if it is damaged. So if that garage is on the border of the property and within a proposed buffer, I'm assuming that's the situation we're talking about.
So it could be repaired now, but if you were to demo it and completely rebuild it, we'd be looking for it to potentially be located outside the buffer. If it can't fit there, or there's not an appropriate spot for whatever reason, you have a steep area or whatever the reason might be, then you could rebuild it. But you would have to just do
Move it as
technical report showing that it's safe. Yeah.
Can you provide examples of instances when development has been prevented due to encroachments on creek boundaries?
Say that again?
Yeah. Can you provide examples of instances when development has been prevented due to encroachments on creek boundaries? So, I mean, currently we have the Mission Creek Ordinance, which prevents or, has a 25-foot buffer from the top of bank. So there's definitely instances under the current rules, if that's the question.
Well, I would say that also through the CEQA process, any buffers that for new development that are proposed as part of that, you have to build outside of that. I don't know of a case though where the city has not allowed any development. No,
I don't think that was the question.
Oh, okay.
I don't think it was whether any, it was just where this has happened, which is lots of cases on creekside properties. Yeah.
Should we open it up for oral questions? I want to make sure to get some time in for.
Yeah, sorry, there's still questions to go through this way.
Oh, okay.
How many total minor creek properties have you visited and evaluated? How many have you determined are not a creek out of that total?
Aaron, I'm going to leave this one to you because you're doing the slides.
I think there are just instances on the map. Like I can think of an instance people might be aware of. It shows a creek behind Gelson's, and it's just a concrete, tiny little swale in the asphalt pavement behind Gelson's. And so like that's an example. That's not a creek. It's going to be removed. I've been to some other site visits where there's just no even depression in the topography. There's nothing there. These are kind of east of Toyon Creek near the Modest. It's hard to describe exactly where, but those will also be removed. So I can't give a specific number of how many we visited. Maybe we visited 20, and some of these are ones we're just aware of ourselves that need to be updated on that map. So maybe there's.
We are also looking at, just so people know, some requests to make major creeks, minor creeks, and or investigating a few of those, like Toyon Creek's one of those.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the spreadsheet I have of updates to make is currently right now 6, but please, if you've got questions about something that doesn't seem like it's a minor creek, please let us know. We're happy to come take a look. That's kind of, we want to get this map as updated as we can with the next round of edits. How are rebuilds? Oh, sorry, I skipped one, but back to this garage question, I think they're following up. They wouldn't be able to build an ADU on top of it.
So actually,
or
what I
redevelop the garage.
mentioned is separate from ADUs. So ADUs those are allowed outside the buffers, but also those state mandated ADUs, which there's a long list of what those are allowed within the buffers if they don't fit outside the buffers, or like if you're altering an existing structure for an ADU.
And if we
Again,
were,
just
yeah,
need the safety check off.
yeah, I was just gonna say if they were converting an existing garage to an ADU, there may be other considerations too, as far as FEMA and floodways changing from a
Oh, yeah,
non-habitable
so
use
this is,
to
yeah, my
habitable use.
answers are really just about this
This
ordinance. I
sorry.
do want to warn you that if you're in a mapped floodway, so I would definitely look up, and I can pull up those maps areas again. You are very limited as to what increasing any square footage or adding structures. And those are just existing federal regulations, but yeah, I guess I'm just talking about the impacts of this ordinance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. How are rebuilds due to a disaster handled when the current house is 100% within this proposed buffer? There's no room to push it out, and that would be the rebuild in another setback.
Yeah, so you're just at that point, if you're completely rebuilding, you're getting the technical reports to show that it's safe. Definitely allowed to have at least your existing square footage, the garage, access to your property, accessory uses, and the ADU, as we mentioned.
I'd also
Again,
add, it mentioned other setbacks, and so the intention there is that you would be allowed to move into front yard or side yard setbacks if that better accommodated moving the structure further from the creek.
yeah, and we're looking at we're looking at a lot of edits to this section, I'd say, like what's allowed, and in addition, like, can we have, like, you're automatically able to change your open yard requirement, or like things that just really ensure that you're not that it's easier to do, easier to rebuild.
Okay, can you explain how this ordinance will streamline the permit process when it's clear that it adds additional layers of discretionary approvals?
So if you are proposing a structure now, a lot of new structures in the city currently require design review, and that's a discretionary process now that triggers CEQA. And so that's where we are required to require a buffer as part of that process. And that's where I mentioned the case-by-case technical report. So for those type of developments, like a new house that trigger design review, or other permits, and this ordinance would actually streamline permitting, because outside of 50 feet or 35 feet or 15 feet, you wouldn't have to get these slew of technical reports unless there was something really unique on your property, like a deep-seated landslide or something unique. And so, yeah, for outside of those distances, it really cuts down on the process and costs associated with building. And for within the buffers, I'd say it just makes it clearer what the process is and what the standards are. If you're doing something now that doesn't require one of these permits, and it's prohibited in the ordinance, then yes, it does add a layer of of new regulation now, but I would just say that that's that's why we are looking at like accessory uses and things, smaller things, to really make sure that we're not making it harder for the smaller uses, because those are really the things that otherwise wouldn't require like a design review permit now.
Okay, and so far the last question, can you go into more detail as to why you have chosen to use top of bank as the boundary rather than the center line of the creek? I think the top of bank approach will lead to significant confusion and unneeded complexity.
Yeah, so it's the industry standard, especially on major creeks, to do top of bank, and that is what is required by the state and others, and all these other ordinances. And the reason for that is that on the big creeks, the creeks move. And also the creeks are a lot different widths. So if we did like a 50-foot setback on let's say Arroyo Burrow Creek, it might not even, you know, it would be a totally different distance from the actual creek side of creek than if we did it from another smaller creek. And so factoring that in, it really is industry standard to do top of bank. We agree it would just be easier. It would be a lot easier. That's why we're hoping if we can simplify it for minor drainages, where they're theoretically those minor drainages are draining a much smaller area. And so and since we're really just trying to keep them from getting blocked, it seems more reasonable that taking a setback from the middle will kind of cover those problems.
Okay, so that was the end of the questions that were submitted. If anyone wants to ask a question, you're welcome to raise your hand and we can call on you to let you present. Oh, Liz, do you see it? I see a hand raised under attendees, but I don't see it under hand raised at the bottom. There is one hand raised if we can unmute them. Okay, well, I wait to see if somebody can figure out how to unmute them. I'm gonna
I think I'm
Oh,
unmuted.
okay.
Oh, okay.
Sorry
Yeah.
about that.
Great. I just want to confirm a couple of things just so I understand for sure. The screening map you've put forth, that for the minor creeks, was any of that actually surveyed, or is it just a surveyor who thinks there might be a potential creek in those areas? Were they actually like done by a professional? Like, did people go in somebody's backyard in the 90s and say, looks like a minor creek?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Erin, you want to go?
I mean, I could try to, but then you can jump in if you've got more to add. My understanding is, it was done by like orthographic surveys. And so it was kind of like a JS exercise, but then there was ground truthing along with it. The other part that complicates that is like some things have changed in some areas. They're just not what was there 45 years ago. But yeah, Melissa, I don't know if you have anything else to add.
Yeah, it was done by a consultant at the request of the city. And again, it's just meant to be a screening map of potential.
But could I just confirm that you're saying like nobody went in my backyard and looked at what you're claiming is a minor creek?
I can't say for sure. I know
Okay.
my understanding is there was some ground truthing along with that exercise, but yeah, I don't think I have records of that from 45 years ago.
Yeah, it's not included in our disclosures or anything. And so it was a little bit of a shocker to see that. I guess the next question is a follow-up one. How will you guarantee fairness and impartiality, Aaron, in specific, since it sounds like you've gone to 20 properties and decided 6 aren't creeks, but looking at the definition that you guys are using, a naturally occurring water course that conveys water seasonally or year-round, and having a bed and banks that may be in a natural state or artificially stabilized, that's awfully broad spectrum. So like if there's a ditch, right? And you look at it, you're like, oh, that looks like a creek, but there's been no water flow for 10 years. I mean, how do you guarantee fairness and impartiality for what you're claiming could be a minor creek? Especially, I'll give you an example. I videotaped for the 5 days of rain to see if any water flowed in what allegedly is a minor creek in my backyard, and there wasn't anything, not once, not a single inch of stream. And I just wonder because I look at it and I'm like, well, I'm terrified to ask you out because I think you'll just say it looks like a creek. But ultimately, I mean, is there any kind of how do we guarantee fairness and impartiality if we're having the Creeks division look at it and not a surveyor or somebody of yeah, you know what I mean? I'm not trying to like knock you
No,
guys, but I want to know how are you going to be fair to homeowners here?
so I mean, it has to convey water. So if it's not conveying any water, um, I think that would partly answer the question there. Um, that's, as Melissa said, this state kind of definition of what meets as a creek. We'd love to have a more accurate map, if I'm being honest. Like, it would just be great if we were just like, this is exactly where the ordinance applies. And so we are working towards that, but we're trying to be fair and impartial as far as what meets that definition. Does it seasonally convey water? Does it have a bed in a bank? Those are the things we're looking at. Is it
So-
historic? Going back and looking at historical images, honestly, I've done in a few cases. Is this something that was here 100 years ago, or is this something that somebody dug to convey water and better, deal with drainage on their property?
I would just, yeah, I get two things with the minor creeks. Our goal with them is really just to not have people unintentionally, in a lot of cases, redirect flows. That's like the main thing with those. And so just that's how we're thinking about it when we're looking at the minor creeks. Because we
Not
see and hear
exasperate
about a
flooding.
lot of problems with that. And so maybe it's not a problem in your neighborhood. The definition is out of the Fish and Game Code, so the California Fish and Game Code. So like technically from the Fish and Game Code, you're not allowed to fill or alter a creek that meets that definition, and we aren't allowed to permit stuff in those state jurisdictional creeks. And so, as we've been talking about, like, how can we make this or, make things easier for people? We do have to contend with that, like how that people know that they can't put stuff in or block the drainage either way because it's a state requirement. And we have had the state get involved in these minor creeks with violations. There was one up on I think the San Roque neighborhood that happened, and you'd be surprised. So we're really just trying to like, how can we make sure that the state mandate gets completed, but isn't too burdensome for people? So we're like, completely open to ideas about how to accomplish that, and the easiest possible way.
So if I show you guys no flow for those 5 days, I mean, and you come over to my property, you say, well, yeah, but it looks like a creek, even though I have video and all that stuff. Are you guys going to say, I mean, that's why it's scary to invite you over. You know what I'm asking? When you got creeks like, I'm glad you addressed the Gelsons, but you've got a creek next to Adams Elementary. I mean, is that mean if they're, whatever, there's an earthquake and their playground, is destroyed that they can't rebuild there?
We don't regulate school district properties because they're not within the city's jurisdiction, but that's a good example. That is a open, natural, that historically was a creek. It's been modified, I will say, that example at Adams School.
Yeah.
But it takes a ton of water. Like, their school floods from the water that comes out of that thing.
I'm
They would
aware.
be also subject, just so you know, they would also be subject to state regulations.
Right. But to get back to your property and specific example of yours, we'd love to take a look. It'd also be looking at what drainage area actually flows to this. Does anything actually come to this feature on your landscape, or has something changed? Is there you know, a storm drain system that's intercepting all of that water, and that's why there's no water, you know, so we would really have to look into the specifics of that.
Yeah, there's a sewer line under where you're saying there's a creek too. Would that impact it? Like a sewer main?
A storm drain main or a sewer main? A sewer
No,
main where they,
a sewer main, like our sewer lateral connects to a sewer main in the backyard
uh-huh.
and it's directly underneath. There's a manhole cover where you have our minor creek.
Yeah, I mean, that wouldn't affect the determination of whether it's a creek or not.
Okay.
Um, okay, we have a couple more questions that have come in. Does that answer the rest of your questions so we can move on, or
Yeah,
happy to
I have
chat
more,
with you
but
individually?
there's a lot of people who probably have questions, so I'd like to let go of my time. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would just say, we're setting up meetings with people. We want to hear about the concerns on your property. So if we didn't have time to answer something today, please call us or set up a meeting online.
Okay. Here's the next couple of questions that have come in. Is there a concern that the additional regulations will ultimately just favor deeper pockets owners, investors who have the resources to navigate the various technical reports and permit exemptions, while the average homeowner ends up being deterred from pursuing similar projects?
Yeah, that's definitely a concern, something we talk about. We don't want to make it more unaffordable to build here. And so I I guess I would just say that it's expensive now. And especially if you're preparing technical reports. And so we really are trying to make it so that all that process and technical reports, those can be expensive, are not needed beyond a certain distance, where we can, make findings that things are safe and etc. So, I mean, it is actually the goal of this ordinance, and if we're not achieving it, then like we want to change that then to make things more streamlined, not to create more burden. And so please welcome any comments to assist with that.
Okay, and that next one is, what is the scientifically proven benefit of doing this? It sounds like many of the building limits are already covered by existing ordinance. You stated that creek buffers give creeks more room to move and be dynamic. There's literally a wall built by the Army Corps of Engineers that this creek is not moving. I don't trust that the city will let me rebuild my home as it's damaged significantly. I don't know.
Um, I don't think it's in the city's interest not to have people rebuild. That's I don't know that I've on for a creek that I've ever seen since I've been at the city say you can't rebuild at all. And so all I can say is that is not at all the intent of the city. That in fact we want to encourage rebuilding and more housing. And so to the degree that you read aspects of this ordinance as saying that, we'd really like to change those aspects of the ordinance, because that is not the intent of the ordinance.
Yeah, I would echo that and say that, there will be changes to that modifications section based on feedback we've already received. And yeah.
Yeah, we've heard some feedback that the way it's written, that says something like the city may approve it. We're happy to change it to shall, but we still have to have finding. Like, so if it's not safe, it has to be shall if it's safe. So, I mean, happy to make that change though, to make it more clear that if you get your technical report, it says it's safe, that the planning commission shall approve it. Any changes like that assist with making you feel more assured, we are completely open to hearing.
And then, sorry, this is a continuation of that one. They're trying to to explore building an ADU. They've already spent a lot of money on that. It's not within the existing 25-foot creek buffer, but Creeks has still blocked the project from going forward, does not make it so expensive that they had to just abandon the project. So I don't know the specifics of that one, but we're happy to talk through it if you want to share your address. You know,
Yeah,
there
on that
are-
one, I think it would be good to set up an appointment,
yeah,
just so we can go through the details of what happened. and
there
how-
are cases, I will say that, you know, even under the existing Mission Creek ordinance, that 25-foot buffer is the required minimum. And there are situations and cases where currently an additional buffer is being asked for. So I don't know the specifics of that case, but that may be what was happening due to, you know, it being a natural section of creek, although it sounded like you're adjacent to the flood control channel from other parts of that question. So yeah, please encourage you to set up a meeting with us and talk through it. All right.
Are there any other questions? People want to raise their hand or anything?
There will be another meeting January, or sorry, oh my gosh, January, April, sorry, Melissa, I should have this up, but
April 2nd,
April 2nd.
from 6 to 7.
And as Melissa said, there's appointment time slots on our website where you can book an appointment. You can also just feel free to call Melissa or myself if you've got specific questions. There's one more
Yeah, and I
question.
really encourage people to submit comments, especially if you have detailed questions, you have detailed uses you're worried about. Makes us think about things people are that you all are thinking about. So please, if you have the time, either give us a call or send a comment letter. And with that, I think we'll end the webinar. Thank you so much for coming, taking time out of your day to work with us on this creek buffer ordinance. We really appreciate it. Have a good day.